This is not just another news cycle. As you've likely noticed from the frantic ticker tapes on Wall Street and the increasingly strained briefings coming out of the Pentagon, we are no longer dealing with standard geopolitical friction. We are performing an autopsy on a dying era. Welcome to the briefing room. Let's cut through the noise and begin the dissection. In the next 120 seconds, we need to reconcile a glaring paradox. Why is a mid-level insurance clerk at Lloyd's of London currently more powerful than a US Navy admiral? As you've noticed during the recent escalations in the Persian Gulf, the media is obsessed with the kinetic, the number of ballistic missiles launched, the tonnage of carrier groups deployed. But if we look beneath the surface, past the smoke of the initial strikes, we find the real black swan Washington didn't see coming. It isn't a weapon of war, it's a piece of paper. For decades, the global economy has operated on a quiet, invisible faith, the freedom of navigation. We assumed that as long as the US Fifth Fleet patrolled these waters, trade would flow. But over the last 48 hours, that assumption has reached a structural dead end, what I call the insurance wall. When the Strait of Hormuz is declared a war risk area, the mechanics of global trade shift, from the military to the actuarial. Even if the US Navy guarantees safe passage, the private sector operates on a completely different incentive structure. If the premium to insure a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, spikes from 1% to 10% of the whole value, that ship doesn't sail. No insurance, no cargo. No cargo, no global economy. The black swan here is not the Iranian blockade itself. It's the sudden realization that the US military is a kinetic solution to a financial problem. We have spent trillions on hardware to fight a 20th century blockade, only to discover we are prisoners of structural pressure, unable to provide the one thing the market actually needs: financial certainty. As you've probably deduced, the US Navy can sink a navy, but it cannot sink a spreadsheet. When the London insurance market blinks, the world stops. We aren't just witnessing a military standoff. We are watching the physical manifestation of institutional failure. The global rules-based order is hitting a wall, and this time, it isn't made of steel. It's made of fine print and risk assessments. Now that we've identified the insurance wall, let's look at the data that explains something extraordinary. Why the United States Navy, the most expensive fighting force in human history, is currently a prisoner of its own design. If we examine the defense to offense cost ratio, we find the first glitch in the system. As you've probably noticed from the recent skirmishes, the math is brutally asymmetric. To intercept a single $20,000 Iranian-made suicide drone, a US destroyer typically launches an SM-2 or SM-6 missile. The price tag? Between $2.1 million and $4.3 million per shot. In a world of finite vertical launch system cells, we are witnessing an incentive failure on a grand scale. The United States is spending millions to negate thousands. A tactical success, but strategically, a bankruptcy. But here's the data point that truly matters to the Joint War Committee in London, the people who actually decide whether a ship sails. It's called the probability of leakage. In the open ocean, the Navy is king. But inside the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide choke point, geography collapses reaction time. Even with a 95% intercept rate, that remaining 5% of leakage represents a total loss for a private tanker owner. For the Navy, 95% is an A grade. For an insurance actuary, a 5% chance of losing a $200 million hull plus $100 million in cargo is an unhedgeable disaster. The US Navy was built for command of the sea, destroying enemy fleets. It was never optimized for security of the sea, providing a 100% micro guarantee for individual private assets in a saturated drone environment. As you've probably noticed, the protection offered by the United States does not actually lower the risk profile on a balance sheet. It merely subsidizes the perception of security, while the underlying financial risk continues to compound. What we are witnessing are the limits of the carrier strike group as a tool of economic stabilization. You simply cannot escort every tanker. There are roughly 2,000 transits through the Strait of Hormuz every month. The US Fifth Fleet has, at best, about a dozen high-end surface combatants available for escort duty. The math does not close. What we are seeing is an institutional mismatch. A 20th century Navy trying to solve a 21st century problem with 19th century escort doctrines. The result? The protection becomes theater, while the real story is written in the data: shipping rates, insurance premiums, delivery delays. And together, they reveal something deeper: a superpower caught inside a structural trap. As you've likely traced on your own mental map, the Strait of Hormuz is often simplified as a gas station for the world. But here's what the mainstream misses. In the 21st century, energy isn't just fuel, it is the raw material of modern computation. To understand the geography of chaos, we have to look east. Yes, the United States has achieved a fragile energy independence through fracking, but our most critical strategic dependencies, the Silicon Shield of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, are still tethered to the Persian Gulf by a 6,000-mile umbilical cord of LNG and crude oil. If you look at the data density in real-time shipping manifests, a terrifying picture emerges. South Korea imports nearly 90% of its hydrocarbons through this gap. Japan, roughly 80%. These are not just numbers on a ledger, they are the literal lifeblood of the clean rooms in Hwasong and Yokohama. As you've probably deduced, an Iranian blockade doesn't just raise the price of a gallon of gas in Ohio, it threatens the existence of the semiconductors in your pocket and the chips powering the servers of Nvidia and Apple. If the LNG tankers stop, the lights go out in the world's most advanced fabrication plants. And here's the part most people don't grasp. A 48-hour disruption in the Gulf can become a 4-month disruption in the global supply of high-end chips. This is the asymmetry of dependency. The United States is a prisoner of structural pressure because we are obligated to protect a waterway to save an industry, tech, that is the backbone of our economy. And we are doing it for allies who are increasingly caught between Washington's security and Beijing's market. But here's the deeper irony, the one I know you've already spotted. The primary beneficiary of a stable Strait of Hormuz is actually China, the world's largest oil importer. Yet it is the American taxpayer and the American sailor who bear the cost of policing it. We are providing a free security service for our greatest geopolitical rival because the alternative, a collapse of the global tech supply chain, is a price we cannot afford to pay. This isn't a strategic choice, it's a strategic trap. Maintain the rules-based order in the Gulf and you subsidize the rise of the East. Fail to maintain it and you trigger a tech depression at home. There is no win state here, only a series of increasingly expensive muddle-through states. You're watching the mechanics of decline in real time. A superpower forced to exhaust its military capital to protect a status quo that no longer serves its long-term interests, but one it is too terrified to let go of. As you've likely discerned, the true crisis in Washington and Wall Street isn't just about the oil, it's about the decay of the American guarantee. Let's look at these survival perspectives from the two rooms that actually run the world. The Wall Street perspective, economic survival. If you speak to the risk desks at Goldman or BlackRock, they aren't looking at conflict as a temporary spike. They are pricing in geopolitical fragmentation. As you've noticed, the market is starting to realize that the US can no longer provide global public goods like maritime security at a discount. The survival strategy for capital right now is decoupling from the sea. Investors are moving toward assets that don't rely on the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing a flight to domestic energy and localized supply chains. Wall Street's survival means accepting that the era of globalized, frictionless trade is over. They aren't waiting for the Navy to fix this. They are betting on a world where the Navy fails. The Washington perspective, political survival. Inside the Beltway, we are seeing what I call the incentive failure of the ruling class. As you've probably deduced from the recent legislative paralysis, policymakers are prisoners of structural pressure. On one side, they cannot afford a total war with Iran because it would bankrupt the already strained US Treasury. On the other, they cannot withdraw because it would signal the formal end of the American century. Their survival instinct has led to a dangerous middle ground, strategic ambiguity by necessity. They are doing just enough to look like they are in control, while privately acknowledging that the US is abandoning the very maritime rules it wrote in 1945. It's not that they want to fail, it's that the system's incentives are now aligned towards short-term crisis management rather than long-term strategic solvency. This is the credibility crisis that Brian Tyler Cohen might highlight, but with a sharper edge. The failure isn't a lack of will, it's a bankruptcy of options. The US is currently a prisoner of its own hegemony, forced to play a game where every move is a losing one on some balance sheet. We have reached the point of strategic convergence. After deconstructing the insurance markets, the naval doctrines, and the fragile silicon supply chains, we must now confront the structural reality of a fading rules-based order. We are not just witnessing a crisis in the Middle East, we are witnessing the eviction of an era. For 80 years, the Pax Americana was built on a singular, massive subsidy. The US taxpayer paid for a navy that provided zero-risk transit for every nation's goods. But as our data crunch showed, the math of 21st century asymmetric warfare has made that subsidy unsustainable. The Fence missile is 100 times the cost of the threat, and when insurance clerks have more veto power than admirals, the American guarantee becomes a historical artifact. As you've probably noticed, the US is currently a prisoner of its own hegemony. If we stay and fight, we subsidize our rivals' energy and bankrupt our future. If we leave, we trigger a global tech depression that destroys our present. It is the ultimate incentive failure, a system designed for total dominance that is now being suffocated by the very rules it created. So here's the question I want to leave you with, the one the pundits in Washington are too terrified to voice. Is the Strait of Hormuz closing because of Iranian mines? Or is it closing because the world's financial system has realized it can no longer afford the price of American protection? The era of frictionless trade is over. We are entering the era of localized risk, where power isn't measured by how many carriers you have, but by how much of your supply chain you can defend without needing a London insurance policy. As you've seen today, the real war isn't happening in the water. It's happening on the balance sheets of the world's most powerful institutions. If you've found this autopsy useful, and if you're among the few who prefer the cold clarity of data over the heat of rhetoric, you know what to do. Click the link below to join our briefing room. Let's keep dissecting the world, one structural failure at a time.